here this morning are integrated pest management. I'm going to go through what that means and all the components within it. We're going to go through and spend a lot of time on scouting. This is the most important part of IPM for sure. And so I'm going to show you some skills that you can learn to help get started within IPM. And we're going to really break it down into insects and disease, and then other diagnosis issues and problems that you may see that aren't really insect and disease related, but may mimic those. Okay. All right. So right off the get-go, integrated pest management, and we call this IPM, and this is a strategic, systematic approach to controlling pest problems in the garden. And this is these can be insects, they can be disease, a whole range of issues can be addressed through this system. And the first step within this is identification of the problem. So if we don't know what the problem is correctly, then we can't really control it. The second one here is monitoring and assessing pest numbers and damage. And so this is what we would call a threshold, trying to develop a threshold of what we're seeing and trying to figure out if this is really a problem or if it's not a problem. The third one are guidelines of when we need to take action, what action we need to do, and when we need to do it appropriately. Fourth part of this is pest problems. Preventing these pest problems is finding some cultural practices that we can utilize to avoid problems from happening in the first place. The fifth is using a combination of different strategies, starting with the least impactful in the environment and then working our way up into the last tool, which should be resulting with chemical control if needed. And six, after action is taken, assessing the effect of pest management, evaluation of how well this worked, if the problem has decreased, and how we move forward from there. So I've got some videos, like I mentioned, that are embedded into the program today. You may have to adjust your audio up or down on your computer or your speakers. I tried to get all these kind of on the same level of audio. So once you adjust your speakers once, hopefully that'll work for you. Howdy. Good morning, folks. I'm here this morning in the Katy Christian Ministries Community Garden. One of our fine master gardeners, Karen, is one of the coordinators for this facility and has allowed me to come this morning to showcase some things for you. And we're going to be talking today about pest and disease management in the garden. We're going to go through steps of integrated pest management. The first step to IPM, or integrated pest management, is called scouting. And basically, this is a simple process of just understanding what's happening in the garden on a regular basis. So I'm going to showcase something for you real quick that everybody should have. This is a very advanced tool that's necessary in this process. This is it right here. It's a coffee cup or tea or whatever your pleasure is in the morning. But what I recommend, folks, is twice a week, every other day, if you're good at it, is to get up early in the morning before work, fill this up with your beverage of choice, and just head out and walk through the garden, sipping on some coffee and just looking at your plants. You want to look for any early signs of damage, discolored foliage, chewed on leaves, holes in leaves, curled up foliage, pest populations, etc. Also, signs of varmin damage. If you have rats, other rodents that may be coming in at night, chewing on, digging in the garden, is looking for these things on a regular basis. Because if we can address them early on before they explode and really start damaging our crops, we can get them under control without having to go so far in the integrated pest management system that we have to rely on chemical pesticides. We want to save that option for the very last way out. If we can scout these gardens regularly and catch these problems before they get out of control, we can usually address them with either mechanical or cultural or biological practices to get it taken care of, and so that our plants can grow back out of that early stress and continue to mature, flowering, fruiting, and giving us the harvest that basically is the reason that we're doing all this. So we're going to be walking around, and I'm going to show you some examples in this garden of stuff that we might want to be looking for. Okay, so to go through these different strategies for control, we're going to talk about some of these individually. Cultural, mechanical, biological, organic, and then chemical, as I mentioned, as our last resort. We're going to go through these individually real quick. Cultural is selecting good quality plants and varieties that are suitable for our area. When we go to some of the big box stores, they're going to have some generic varieties there that may have not been tested for growing well in Texas. They may have a variety that's a standard that goes all the way across the United States. And those may be varieties that are going to be susceptible to pest and disease problems and just general plant stress here. Rotating crops is very important. This is switching out plant families in our garden beds throughout the seasons so that we don't build up populations of pests in specific areas. We look at the picture of the tomato here. The tomato is in the nightshade family, along with several other plants that we use in the garden. And so we will need to move these around, because if we leave these plant family specific items together in the garden, we're going to get buildup of disease pressure, of insect pest pressure, and so we need to move those around. Consider companion plantings of herbs with our vegetables in the gardens. There's lots of material online on vegetable companion plantings out there to look at. And then the last one here are trap crops. A trap crop would be something like a black-eyed pea, or some people use okra as a trap crop. Plants that insects cannot resist and will be pulled to, and you could either do that as just a simple means to get them away from your crops, or use it as a way to pull them in and then use some soft pesticide to eliminate some of those populations. Mechanical, and this is similar to that, but going a little bit further on how we can impact those pest populations by plowing or tilling the soil. So if we have some soil-borne insects that may be embedded down into the soil, we can disrupt their life cycle. Keeping the area clear of weeds. A lot of weeds can act as a habitat for pests. And then as your plants mature, all they have to do is bounce from those weeds over onto your plants. Very simple of crushing eggs. If you see egg masses or specific pests like stink bugs, like leaf-footed bugs, or loopers, caterpillars, is just to pick them up, remove them, squish them, knock them off with the water hose. Just ways that we're going to disrupt the life cycle of those pests. The third one here is the biological control of using living organisms to help do the work for us. And so this for insects, this could be beneficial or predatory insects. For disease control, there are several different beneficial fungi that work against harmful or pathogenic fungi in the garden. Spraying BT, which is a bacterium that we can spray on the foliage of plants that when larvae, in this case here, the caterpillars, ingest that BT, it disrupts their digestive system and then they die. So all these are available from different sources, and so utilizing ones in the garden is a good idea, but a lot of the time Mother Nature, if we allow her, will bring these in there for us and we don't have to purchase them. Oops. Organic products. Okay, these are pesticides, but we tend to lump the organic products into a class that we call soft pesticides. And this is a good choice if we're worried about chemical residues on our fruits and vegetables. And these tend to be products that when we put out, they do the job that they were designed to do, and they dissipate very quickly. So they tend to be a little safer for us, but not as long lasting in the garden. Pyrethrins is a natural derivative of a plant. A spinosad is a natural derivative from a fungi. And we have a whole range of insecticidal soaps and oils that are from natural derivatives that we can use to spray on plants or directly on pests to impact them. Chemical control, again, this is the option for us in our toolbox of pest control, but again, the concept of IPM is to leave this for last. We get to a point where we call a threshold, and that threshold is when we decide that we need to spray or it's time to remove the plant. Those are our two options at this point. Okay, so if we've tried everything else and we're still having a significant pest problem, we want to use a chemical pesticide, 7, malathion. There's a whole list of others that are safe in the garden to use. They will really knock those pest populations back. They give us some residual in the garden, but equally here when we're at this point where if we have a pest problem that's this far out of hand, if you're not comfortable using chemicals in the garden, chemical pest control, then your other strategy here would be to go ahead and remove those plants from the garden and just cull that out and re-prepare the soil and get ready to try a different crop in that spot the coming season. So when we're looking at pests and we're doing pest identification, just a couple simple things that we want to try to understand so that we can start learning what is what are we seeing out in the garden. And there's a range of insects here that go through a complete life cycle. And what this is that they have a larval stage and they have an adult stage. So we see the egg in the middle, and then when those eggs hatch, they develop into a legged mobile larvae, and then they'll pupate into the adult form that feeds, mates, lays eggs, and then completes that full life cycle over and over again. So for instance, in this one here, this is for the lady beetle. We definitely recognize the adult lady beetle at the bottom, but some of us may not recognize this little alligator orange and black crawler that we might see and mistake as some type of a terrible pest on those plants. And so we would want to know what this is before we decided to kill it. We don't want to kill these. And then we have here another range of insects that go through an incomplete life cycle, which basically, when those eggs hatch, they start off as nymphs, and they're just very young, and they just gradually get bigger and older and uglier as they mature into an adult. They don't go through this metamorphosis stage. They just get bigger, and so this is going to be all of our stink bugs and leaf-footed bugs. This is also going to be like our grasshoppers, katydids, etc. are going to fall into this category. You notice the difference in the egg masses in the picture in the middle here. If you start studying all the different types of egg masses, you'll be able to learn how to identify those and respond appropriately. So when we're looking at the problems that we're seeing on our plants, we start trying to figure out what these eating patterns look like. And so while we have caterpillars, loopers, borers, etc., that either chew on leaves, in this case we have a stem borer that's chewing out the center of the stem, versus what we would see with stink bugs or leaf-footed bugs in the second picture there at the bottom. We would just see these clusters of the young insects and little pit marks where they're just sticking their mouth part down into either the fruit or foliage, resulting in just a little poke hole. Sometimes it's a black hole with a little yellow circle around that, where they're sucking the chlorophyll out of the leaf. So lots of different stages, lots of different feeding patterns, and just gradually with time, you'll learn to identify the differences. Peggy, do we have any questions yet that I might want to address?
We have a couple. I think one would be good if we hold it to the end. And then there is a kind of a little technical issue, Boone. We're all seeing a small black square on the bottom. Mine is on the bottom right of my screen that's got my initials in it, but it's kind of blocking some of the presentation. So is that something you're controlling? I couldn't make it go away.
I don't know. Let me see. Go back.
There it went.
There.
Thank you.
Well, we'll see if I can find that when I need to later. All right. Yeah. Besides for that, we just want to hold off on the questions.
Yeah, there's one I think that would be good to do at the end, and that's all we have right now.
Okay. Good deal.
Mhm.
I'm going to start us off here this morning looking at some watermelons. Midsummer is a great time for us to do any of the assortment of melons, watermelons, honeydew, Crenshaw, sweet melons, muskmelon, etc. They love it hot, but we can get some pest and disease problems on these pretty quickly if we're not watching. These ones look pretty good. We've got good green leaves here. One thing we would want to look for, if we have a lot of rain, they can suffer powdery mildew damage on the foliage, which is a fungal disease, which basically looks like somebody poured milk over the top of the leaves and let it dry on there. It leaves this powdery white residue on the leaf surface, and will eventually kill the plant, and we won't get any of these beautiful melons out of it. This one looks pretty good here. I don't see any powdery mildew. There is a little bit of leaf miner damage that's tunneling through the foliage. That tends to just be aesthetic, not really damaging for us. So we'll walk past that. Other leaf beetles and other pests, vine borers, etc., we would be looking for that could be more problematic. But in this case, these melons look pretty good. One thing that we've done here that's been pretty cool is trying to safeguard these melons. When we do get a lot of rain here occasionally, and if we just have these melons sitting on the soil out here in the garden, we're going to start off with this yellow area, if we can see that on the fruit, and that's perfectly fine and normal, and is a pretty good clue that this fruit is nearing ripeness or fully ripe. If this starts turning golden here, and we got a pretty good thud to this where it's been sitting, if this is flipped upside down, that's a good signal that this fruit is ready to be harvested. But the same thing here, if we let that soft spot that's sitting on the soil there sit too long, and we have a lot of rain and there's a lot of dampness in the soil, we can start getting a bacterial soft rot in that area. Starts off this bacteria spore penetrating the skin, and then it slowly works its way into the rind of the fruit, and then we end up with a real soft, squishy area. And if we cut this open, we would see it's gray on the inside and nothing that we really want to eat. So what I found here in the garden that they're using are these really cool tools, and these are just little stakes. These are specifically for this. This is called a melon and squash cradle that they purchased, and you just stick these down into the soil with a little stake on the bottom, and we set that fruit on top of this, and it's got some perforated edges here to allow some airflow underneath the fruit, so we'll avoid this ripe base here from turning into a bad spot for us. But cool tool right here. Okay, so that is, let me try to find where my little, let me double click here. Whoops. I find where, oh, shoot. Okay. So that one there would be considered a cultural practice of lifting those fruit up, allowing a little airflow underneath there so that they don't succumb to bacterial issues. Okay, what we're looking at here are some young fall cucumbers, and we've got some trellising in place, and they're taking off pretty well. But since I'm out here by myself, I'm going to try to zoom in on this one little spot here, and then use this as our example. Let's see if this works. Okay, right there. Okay, so on these plants here, again, scouting is very important, because at a distance, when I'm looking at these plants, they look fine. But as I get up close, I'm starting to notice some issues that need to be addressed pretty quickly. The first one that's most clear is similar to the melons over there. We've got some leaf miner, okay, and this is a worm or a larvae of a small moth that embeds itself into the leaf tissue here, and it just kind of curls and twirls around in there. And if it gets bad enough, it'll cause the leaf to curl up. Okay, but if this is all we're seeing here, this isn't really going to be a big problem for us. Again, it's simply aesthetic and the damage. But there's something else that's going on here, because I see from a distance, if you look at the sunlight on these leaves, it's kind of glossy. It's kind of reflective and glossy. And that's a sign that we've got some honeydew. And honeydew is the secretions from soft-bodied insects. And so if I'm looking at this, actually at the top of the leaf, I can see a bunch of moltings from whitefly, which is a small piercing sucking insect. And then if I turn the leaf over, I don't know if you can see, hopefully you can from the camera angle there, there's just a bunch of little small flecks on there, green little flecks. And those are green aphids. And there's a whole bunch of them underneath here spread out around the leaf. And the bad thing about aphids is that their populations can explode very, very quickly. Actually, the females, they're all female, they're born pregnant. And then when they have babies, they're all girls, and then they're born pregnant. And so it doesn't take long at all for these populations to get out of hand. And as they're sucking the juice out of the leaves, gradually they're just becoming stressed. You see these are yellow, thin, and then they're just starting to kind of wilt over. So having a combination of these whitefly and these aphids in here, if we don't address this pretty quickly, then we're really not going to get the vigor out of these vines that we'd hope for to get them up on this trellis, growing and producing a whole lot of cucumber for us here. I've got a couple little young cucumbers, like pickling cucumbers there, but we want a whole lot of it, okay? And so if we don't address this, these plants are going to be stressed, and they're not going to mature the way that we hope that they would. So small populations of these, we would leave this to Mother Nature to come in here. We'd have some predatory insects that would feed on these, but since it's as bad as it is, like, I don't know if you can see that, it's just covered with aphids down there. We may want to treat this, starting off with a soft product, like a horticultural soap or oil, and just a gentle spray up underneath the leaves of these, as much as we can turn the wand to get up underneath the foliage here, to actually come in contact with these aphids to knock those populations down. And then we hope that some beneficials will come in here and start predating upon whatever's left. And then so at that point, these plants have a better chance of getting up and getting growing for us. I'm going to try something real quick because I would like to mute my microphone. So I may have to go back to here. Peggy, I'm sorry, but I may have to have this on here so that I can mute my microphone here as needed. I think it's the only way I know how to do it, unfortunately.
We'll survive, Boone. Don't worry about it.
Right, I'll move on to the next one. Are the videos playing okay?
I think so.
Okay, good.
I mean, I for me they are. I think you're fine. Yeah. We have a couple of questions if you'd like to.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
You want to hear them? Okay.
Sure.
The first one is, in general, how do we tell whether there is a pest/disease versus natural aging or leaf death? And then another question about the wisdom of using a dish detergent and water to kill aphids. And if that's a good solution, any particular type or ratio.
Okay. I'm going to save the aging one. On the soap, there will be some recipes that you can find online for using hand dishwashing soap. The issue there is that you can easily go over the concentration that you would want to use, depending on the weather. If it's windy and sunny, hot, dry, and we use too much concentration of those soaps, we can do a whole lot of damage of burning those plants. And then we've got another whole issue that we're dealing with. That's why purchasing some products, these soft products that are labeled for this use, insecticidal soaps and natural oil products. There's going to be rates that will be on the label of those products that are going to ensure that we can get some control and we're not going to create any other secondary issues with us damaging the plants unintentionally. But the other question on the aging, etc., I'm going to cover in a video that's coming up. All right. What I have here are some eggplants that were planted in spring and allowed to continually grow all summer. And up until now, it looks like these have done really good. They're very tall, bushy, wide. They've got some good shade underneath here, so it's moderating the soil temperature. But just from a distance here, we're going to start off kind of panned out with this shot. There's obviously something going on here. While eggplant tends to have foliage that's a little grayish looking, a little pubescent, it has hair. Okay, what I have here are some eggplants that were planted in spring and allowed to continually grow all summer. And up until now, it looks like these have done really good. They're very tall, bushy, wide. They've got some good shade underneath here, so it's moderating the soil temperature. But just from a distance here, we're going to start off kind of panned out with this shot. There's obviously something going on here. While eggplant tends to have foliage that's a little grayish looking, a little pubescent, it has hairs that grow kind of all over the plant. It shouldn't look like this. This is yellow and mottled. On here, it's grayish and yellow and mottled to give us a clue that something is wrong. Now I'm going to try to not make you too dizzy, but we're going to bring in here and I'm going to try my best to get us in a little closer into this shot here, okay? So from right here, we're looking at these leaves right here, I believe. From the top, we can see this mottling of the foliage is yellow and grayish, splotches all over it. And so if I turn that over, I see webbing all down the midrib here on both sides. And I see a little webbing going out onto these ribs on the sides. And if I got up really close, which I wouldn't be able to do with this camera with you, we would actually see the little red spider mites underneath there crawling around. Well, they're called spider mites because they produce this little webbing on them. It's a protective webbing. So that's a pretty good clue. If I flip this over, if I saw some insects in here, it could be a couple different things. There are some insects called lace bug that can do a very similar type of damage. But when I see this webbing here, and if I got it real close and I can see the coloration of these little critters are reddish, then we pretty much know that we've got some red spider mite damage here. And so what they do, again, there's just a bunch of them underneath there, and they're just rasping and sucking the juice out of the foliage and causing the plant to lose vigor. As they suck the green pigment tissue out of the leaves, that's what causes the yellow mottling on the top part of the leaf. Like here's a pretty bad one right there. You see it's just losing all of the green pigment on top. And there's actually on this one here, there's some spider mites on the top, but the vast majority of them are feeding on the bottom of the leaves. Most of these insects that we see in the garden, they like to be on the bottom because they don't get hit by sunlight and by wind and rainfall. and they can just live underneath there, and they can just suck away to their heart's delight. But again, on this has gotten a little out of hand. Um, so what we may need to do, if we want to continue to grow this plant into fall, is we would want to treat the bottoms of the leaves with a soap, like a horticultural soap, and to knock those populations back. If this gets any worse than it is right now, where we have more defoliation, see if we got some yellowing leaves here that are just starting to fall off the plant. If we see a lot more of that, then that's when we come to this, you might say, crossroads, where we need to decide if we want to go ahead and just take these out of the garden and then go ahead and cultivate the soil and start getting ready for fall and growing plants in here that are not in this family, not in this nightshade family. Plants that we could grow in here that are not susceptible to the same pests in the garden. So we still have a lot of warm season left. So if you got these plants growing again, they would, there are blooms on these plants. They would grow back for us and produce more fruit. But if the condition continually declines, let's get them out of here and get this material out of the garden and get ready to plant something else in its spot. Okay, so I'm going to go through, try to roll through these real quick. I'm not going to read the details. Again, you will have a copy of this presentation later to go through if you want to look at each of these individually. But these are just some examples. By no means am I covering all of the individual pests and diseases, but just some things that you might be looking for that are pretty obvious. In this case, the mealy bugs here, they cluster up together, and it looks like you've got a kind of a cotton in little corners and little nooks and crannies of those leaf nodes. Something to look for. And again, they just sit there in their clusters and suck on the plant and causing them to decline. Aphids, one that we always see in the garden. So many different species of aphids. These ones here, yellow and orange. They'll be green, red, whitish, different sizes. But again, they form dense colonies very quickly because of their ability to reproduce fast. And they not only suck on the plant, but they tend to leave a whole lot of honeydew, their secretions, on the lower leaves. And then we end up getting this black sooty mold that grows on those, and then that harms the plant even further. So we want to keep an eye out for extreme aphid populations and address those appropriately. Stink bugs, lots of different types of stink bugs that we'll see, green and brown, and with all of these, similar, they have a long proboscis, or their mouthpiece, that just pokes into leaves, stems, and fruit and sucks the juice out. And the problem with them tends to be that it sours fruit for us, like in this tomato, as they're injecting the enzymes in there to break down the leaf tissue or foliage and fruit skin. A lot of times we'll get bacteria embedded into the fruit, and we'll get a real nasty spot in there that we don't want to eat. Squash bugs are in the same family. You can see the same geometric shape to them as they become the adult, and then they just move around and cause a lot of plant damage. Leaf-footed bugs, again, these are a type of stink bug, characteristic of their longer legs, and they tend to fly around more in the garden. You can see the nymph phase at the bottom. They're orange or yellow in color, and they tend to be clustered together. You'll see a whole gang of them in one spot there. And so with these, when they're nymphs, they're easy to control with soft products as they become adults. Even chemical options are limited because of their waxy cuticle. They tend to just shed off pesticides without impacting them. So we would recommend scouting for these. If you see them, try to grab them and squish them. Some people bring just a cup of oil and water with them as they're walking through the garden, and just dropping them in there, letting them drown in a solution as they're walking through the garden. If you squish them, your hands are going to smell like a combination of sour apple and diesel fuel. FYI. Tomato hornworms and other types of hornworms as well cause a lot of foliar damage very quickly because of the size of these. As you can see, it says here, these grow to about 4 inches in length and can do a whole lot of damage very quick. So if you go out to your tomato plants or peppers and you notice that half of the plant has been defoliated overnight, just look around. You'll probably end up finding him during the day. They tend to burrow down into the mulch, and then they come out in the evening and at night, and then after about mid-morning, they burrow back down into the ground for safety. But if you get out there early and dig around the plant, you find these, and the easiest way is just to remove them physically and get them out of there, or you can spray a BT product. It's a bacterium, so as they feed on the BT, it impacts their digestive system and they die. Cabbage loopers, similar. This is another caterpillar larvae that will just tear up leaves. And in the case of cabbage, we want to eat the leaves, so you get a lot of holes in the foliage, and the frass, their secretions or waste, will accumulate on the leaves and down in those nodes, and it makes the leaf messy and something that we may not want to eat. Cucumber beetles, other beetles as well, do a whole lot of foliar damage. This here, the top one, we look at that, it kind of resembles a lady beetle, but just a little bit of research on your part, you'll know pretty quickly that this has more of a elongated a thorax, and the winged part of the body where the dots are is elongated or more oval shaped compared to what we would see with our lady beetles. So with time and practice, you'll learn how to identify the difference between these pests and our beneficials. Squash vine borers is a huge nuisance for us if we're growing any type of a squash plant that vines in the garden. You can see the big moth here. It's a very beautiful moth. Usually in the evenings, we'll see them fluttering around the garden or sitting on top of the leaves. They deposit eggs onto the plant, usually down by the leaf nodes, and then the larvae, which are these worms here, they crawl down into the stem and chew their way through the stem. And overnight, we'll see the decline, and then once the sun comes up the next day, these vines will fall over, wilt, and don't really come back because these larvae have eaten out all the tissue in the stem and virtually killed the plant at that point. So we want to look for the moths. We want to look for these eggs that will be deposited down along the nodes. And then if we see these plants wilting, is to get those out of the garden before this thing can complete the life cycle. Because once those larvae metamorphosize or pupate into the adult, they continue the life cycle and move to other plants. So we can disrupt the life cycle by getting them out of there, discarding that material, burning it, whatever we need to do to impact that larvae. Cutworms, again, another caterpillar larvae that basically just annihilates a plant from the get-go, just cutting off the stem. And so a problem with corn and other plants that have single stems, they just chew around the base and then the whole top of the plant falls over. So with these, we kind of need to know in scouting what we're looking for. If we see any early damage down towards the ground, um, of either trying to find these young cutworms and removing them, or again, we can use a BT based product down towards the base of these stems as a protective measure as they mature. Flea beetles, another type of feeding leaf uh, insect that just chews on the leaves, and so we have these small shot holes all over the foliage, and particularly if it's leafy greens that we're wanting to harvest, you have holes on them, and you have a lot of their frass on the leaves, and it's really affects the aesthetics and the quality of the vegetables. So we want to keep an eye on these early on and try to treat them as necessary. For these, the products with the active ingredient of spinosad, which is a organic product, would be useful if we see these either the adult phase of the flea beetles or the larvae feeding on the leaves early on. Leaf miner that I mentioned, you would see this zigzagging tunneling within the plant, and it just basically this adult here lays the egg into the foliage, and the larvae just crawls around eating it. And so most of the time this is not really an issue that we want to address. It's pretty random, and the plant will tend to continue growing with no problem. If the plant leaves get curled up real bad, then yes, we want to do something to try to impact those, and that would be applying some BT product or doing night spraying with a soft insecticide because the adult is night active. Pinworms and miners in fruit, and we'll see these little holes in the fruit where we got small larvae that's eating away of the internal part of the flesh there. This one is tough. That it's going to be random when you'll see this damage, but you would just try to identify fruit that have a whole lot of this, and then just pick those fruit and discard those fruit and get them out of there. That's the best way to just stop the life cycle of these particular pests. Similarly, fruit worms, these burrow down into the center of the fruit and really gouge them out from the inside. And this is one that spraying early on with BT product as a preventative would be a good idea. But beyond that, if we see fruit that have been impacted, obviously this one here, we don't want to eat this. So we need to pull that off the plant early on and discard of it properly so that this particular bugger is not going to get a chance to reproduce in our garden. And similarly, what we tend to not see slugs and snails during the daytime, but we see here from the green leaf, the damage on here. It looks similar to what we think would be a caterpillar or a grasshopper, and it's just rasping of the foliage. And these ones are a little bit more difficult to control. If we can get out early in the morning while there's still a heavy dew, we may still see some of these snails and slugs moving around, and just to pick them off the plant and discard them. There are some baits and products that can be used. Just make sure that whatever you do use is labeled for use in and around food producing gardens, because some of the products that are out there for general landscape use are quite toxic. Other stuff that we'll see is damage from birds and mice and rats, etc. Of just the side of the fruit pummeled out where they've eaten seeds, the flesh, just maybe trying to get some moisture. We'll see fruit on the ground with holes in it. So we'll start to learn the different types of damage and then try to respond to each of those necessary. For birds, depending on how bad they are, we may want to think of some netting or just harvesting early. You know, when the fruits start to turn color, is to harvest those and let them finish maturing off of the plant, because once they turn fully ripe and red, they're very attractive to birds. And then if we've got problems with squirrels, rats, armadillos, raccoons, possums, etc., let's try to identify what's coming in there. And so you may, depending on how hardcore you are with this, you may, get a night game camera set up out there to identify the culprit, and then use the best strategy to either trap or isolate those particular pests. All right, well, let me stop here real quick and ask Peggy if we have any pressing questions right now.
We do not.
Oh, good.
We have a few we can save to the end, but
okay.
I think we can go.
Yeah. Good deal. All right, let's move on to this one. Okay, what we're looking at here is a young apple tree, and we have been trying to pick some varieties of apples that will. Okay, what we're looking at here is a young. Okay, what we're looking at here is a young apple tree, and we have been trying to pick some varieties of apples that will grow well for us here in Southeast Texas, and we just haven't found one that's great, but we're going to keep trying. And we've got a couple apple trees here in the garden, and Karen with the garden, she asked me to look at this and said she noted some black spots or dots on the leaves and looked like an issue potentially. Again, we are scouting for symptoms early on, so this is part of the IPM, and so I'm gonna try here to zoom in onto this branch right here and see what we can find. Okay. Now, I hope I don't move too far, but pretty quickly I can see, if I turn this over, I can see these black spots that she's talking about. And you can't really see up close here, but what this looks like here, if I got really close, is that these are probably mummified or dead aphids, the shells of aphids, because right here next to it on the upper leaves, I see a whole lot of young green aphids on the leaves, and then I see some of the darker ones as well, the black ones. Same thing here, this leaf has a whole lot of aphids on it. And so a couple things that's going on with this, I noted over on the other side of the plant that there are some lady beetles that are feeding on the plant. Take us back here to the overall plant. There are some lady beetles that are feeding on it. And there's probably some flies and small wasps that are parasitizing these aphids. So this is when we get into a situation where we have to make a decision.
we have some beneficials here that are working to keep these populations down. Right now, while I see some aphid populations at the new growth, I see some mummified aphids. So I know I have some beneficial insects there. I see an adult lady beetle walking up and down the stem. It's eating. It's probably laying eggs, and its larvae will be devouring these aphid populations. On this leaf here, which I can't even zoom in the camera to show you, there are some lacewing eggs. They look like little Q-tips that are attached to the leaf. So when those lacewing eggs hatch out, those larvae will move around the plant, gorging on aphids. And so this is a perfect example of why my recommendation would be to not treat this. We've got Mother Nature's working hard, sending some defenses here to keep those populations in check without us having to spray. If we sprayed even a soft insecticide like an oil or soap on here, we're going to impact those beneficial populations, and the aphids are going to flare up much faster again than our beneficial populations are going to be able to rebound, to grow back up numbers that they can impact the population of aphids. So in this case here for this apple, just keep it healthy, keep the soil good, keep the water right, keep the fertilization correct, keep it pruned properly, keep some of these branches could probably be cut out of here, some of these cross branches, to allow more sunlight and airflow down into the canopy. But as far as the insect pressure, we're going to let Mother Nature do the job on this one.
Okay, so just a real good example there. After we've scouted and we've studied the threshold, we've noted that there are some beneficials working on those pests, and so we can make a good decision just to leave that one alone. Pretty cool. Okay, so again here, things that you'll be looking for. These are the different life stages of lady beetles. And we can see the egg masses there, the pupa, the larvae, one hatching larvae there, one that is just getting ready to pupate, I think, into the adult, and then some feeding adults on there as well. So we're going to look for all these different ones on the plant. Similarly, here is a green lacewing. The adults at the top left, we tend to see these usually at night, or they're more active, the adult is. But over towards the right, we see those eggs. It looks like a little Q-tip that's glued on the leaf, spread out in these spirals. And then over at the bottom left, we see the crawler. And this mean little alligator just moves around the plant and just eats aphids like crazy. Eats scale, eats whitefly, mealybug, etc. And then they tend to be called trash bugs because as they feed, they just throw the skeletons, the exoskeletons of the insects that they've devoured over the top of them, and they mount up on their back. And this is done as a way to kind of camouflage them on the plant and to keep birds and other predators from eating them. And so they just keep throwing those carcasses on their back and just moving around and eating like crazy. So we want to look for the crawler. We want to look for those egg masses. And then if we see these small winged adults in the area, is to leave them be. And the different life stages of these, and particularly the lady beetles, the adults feed on nectar, and they are attracted to a whole lot of different plants. So incorporating some plants into the garden to not only attract, but to act as a habitat and full life cycle food source for those predators is quite important. So what I found is probably the best are the fennels, dills, parsleys of creating an area for those adults to feed and reproduce. They work very well. Okay, well, let's move on here. The second part of this is plant diseases. And for plant diseases, this is the alteration of a plant that interferes with its normal structure and function and renders it unfit for its normal use. So there's a difference between a plant or a pathogen or organism and disease. The disease is when that pathogen is able to affect the plant in a negative way. Okay, so we can have the pathogen or the organism active in those areas, but until they impact the plant in a negative way, we don't call that a disease. Okay, so for a disease to happen, we have this thing called the triangle. And we have to have all three of these things working together for us to get a disease, for a disease to take hold. We have to have this pathogen, and we have to have its susceptible host, and we have to have those together in a conducive environment for this pathogen to be able to impact that susceptible host. So what we try to do in this concept of the triangle is if we can eliminate one of these three in some form or fashion, being creative, then we can really lessen the problems that we'll have with plant disease in our gardens. So early on, we'll be looking at some symptoms of plants. We will see wilting. We'll see leaves turning brown. We'll see rotting on the fruit. We'll see the stem is going to have blight or discoloration, galls or necrosis at the base. We're going to have root rot. We're going to see root knot nodules on the roots, etc. Things that are going to be clues of disease symptoms in the garden. And so scouting, again, is very important in this process.
Okay. So what we see right here is a bed of peppers. And these peppers look like they may have been planted in spring, and that they've been seasoned through the summer and cut back to try to grow back up. They've burned a little bit of soil around the base of these plants to try to encourage them to put on some new leaves at the base. But right in the middle of this whole row, which looks pretty good, I see this one guy here that is not doing very good, and arguably the one right next to it there. And so with peppers, the peppers are in the same family as eggplant and tomatoes and Irish potatoes, and they succumb to some very similar issues, and there are some different blights and root rots that are fairly common to these plants, and sometimes it's unavoidable. Sometimes just really good care. If you have very good healthy plants, they can fight off potential infection from either fungal or bacterial diseases. But in this case here, it looks like we've got something going on. And again, scouting is important. We're out here looking for clues, and the fact that we've got a whole bed here down the road that look pretty good. And this way it looks pretty good. This guy looks terrible. And then the one next to it here looks like it's starting to wilt over. And then arguably the one right here, the leaves are starting to kind of wilt over on the top. Not quite as bad, but still something I think is happening here. So this guy, there's no turning back, okay? And so I hope that the gardeners here will not mind that I'm going to rip this up and gently pull it up. If it doesn't want to come up and pull the whole roots up, if you want to take a shovel underneath there, pry that up and try to get the roots of the plant so we can look at it. So with this one, the first thing that I would want to look for when we yank this up out of the ground on the roots would be to check for any type of root nodules. Okay, looks like maybe there's little pearls that are growing on the roots that would suggest that maybe we had some root knot nematode issues, which are fairly common on peppers. But in this case here, I'm looking around at the roots and some of the younger roots on here, and I'm really not seeing any, okay? So we can rule out nematodes on this particular plant. And so the other thing that we want to inspect is up on the plant. And so if I look here at the base, I see a discoloration that's moving up, and I see some necrosis or dead tissue down here towards the base. And then almost right towards the very bottom, it's fairly rotten. Okay, so we're dealing with some type of a root rot issue here. This is probably based off of a blight, summer blight, or late blight, and it's infected here at the base of the plant, and it's migrating up the stem. We can see the discoloration as it's moving up, and then this is all dead and decaying here. So there's no turning back for this plant. So something that we may want to think about, I'm going to pull this out and probably get it out of the garden. But the next step would be to rake up any of its leaves that fell off that are in the garden here with it, and take those with me, okay? Further than that, my recommendation to the gardeners here, probably going to be to go ahead and take these two plants out. I don't want to take the liberty to do that yet, but I will recommend it to them because these are issues that, you know, under the right environmental conditions, heavy rain can splash those spores onto other plants. Spores can be active in the soil as well, so it can infect the plants that are close to it and start migrating around the garden. So if we eliminate the plants here that are impacted, then we've got a pretty good chance that we can stop this particular issue from migrating over to our other plants. So if we took these three out of here, these pepper plants, we may want to replant something that's not in this plant family, the susceptible plant family, which is the nightshade family. So we would come in here with something different. Probably some leafy green vegetables as we're going into fall. We could do some cabbages, broccoli, cauliflower, etc. Staying away from plants that are in this same family that would succumb to similar disease pressure.
Okay, how are we doing on questions, Peggy?
We're good, Boone.
Very good, thank you. Okay, so after a little bit of research here, cross-comparing, we can see from this picture here, this fusarium is a root rot issue that starts at the base of the plant and moves its way up the stem. And so we look at this, what we call necrosis, and this brown stem. And if we see that on a plant and it looks yellow up above that and it's migrating up the stem, unfortunately, once it gets to this point, the best measure is to go ahead and remove that plant and any surrounding plants that are starting to show symptoms. And then again, coming back into those areas with a plant that is in the different plant family that is not susceptible to the same issues. And just to kind of give you another example for a bacteria, this one here, rose family members are all susceptible to this, and this is spread by pollinators actually to the new tips, the flowering tips of plants, and you start to see the end of those twigs just wilt down. And some plants are more susceptible than others, so this is when it's important for us to choose varieties that are resistant to fire blight. And so, for instance, if you purchased an apple or a pear tree, which are quite susceptible to this, you would look for a variety that has some fire blight resistance to it, and then just working in the garden to try to decrease that suitable environment for this disease to take hold. Just wanted to show a picture here when I mentioned the root knot nematode. Again, the nematode is the pathogen, and creates this root knot disease that impacts the plant. You get these in the picture here. You see these little nodules that grow on the roots, and when it gets bad enough, basically the plant roots cannot send water and nutrients from the roots up to the stem and to the leaves, so the plants start wilting during the day, and gradually the health of the plant becomes stunted and goes downhill. And so unfortunately, the only way to test for this is to remove the plant. So if you dig it up, try to dig up the root system as much as you can, and you would identify these nodules. Of course, you would want to discard those plants appropriately. Don't put those in the compost pile. Cultivate that soil, and then try to plant a plant species or something in the plant family that is not as susceptible to nematode damage. And so following, again, this IPM system here, we have the cultural, mechanical, organic, and then the chemical controls. Really the best for disease, it's best to try to stick with the cultural practices for the most part, because usually with disease, once we see damage from disease, in most situations, it's really too late for us to be able to address that with a disease control product, whether it's organic or chemical. Our best bet here is to be wise and creative in making decisions with these cultural practices. So for instance, here it's choosing the right plants, the right varieties. Okay, buying them for their specific resistance to disease, planting them in the right place, in the right situation, and good quality soil. When you purchase your plants, is look at them, inspect those plants, the leaves, the stem, the roots. Make sure that you're not bringing a disease home with you already. Create the right growing conditions so you're building good soil. We need to rotate those crops, so create some type of a schedule in the garden where we're being wise and trying to remember what we planted in this bed this year, and then switching those out on either a 2 or a 3 year rotational pattern to break that disease cycle. Proper fertilization and watering and drainage are crucial to minimizing disease pressure. Okay, here we go.
What we're looking at right here is a young fig tree, and this one here is a pretty good example of a good, well-trained fig tree. If you've grown figs in the garden, you'll know sometimes they can get a little out of hand size-wise. They produce a lot of vigorous new shoots, and if not pruned back properly early on, you can end up with a plant that's 12, 15 feet tall and very hard to manage size and the canopy of the plant. One thing I would like to just go through with this real quick. Figs in our area along the coast with our high humidity, they tend to succumb in the summer to a pathogen. And I'm going to try to get this up kind of close here. Okay. Now this leaf right here, if we can see underneath here, there's little rusty little spots starting to pop up over on this side. Oops, there's some little rusty little spots. And then on the top of the leaf, I can get that in the sunlight there. There's some little rusty colored spots. And this is the beginning of a disease on these that's called fig leaf rust. And the leaf rust on these is a fungal pathogen that embeds into the leaf, and if it's allowed to reproduce, it spreads and eventually will cover the whole top of the leaf. Will look very rusty colored, mottled all over the leaf, and then the leaves turn yellow and will fall off of the plant. But the best way to avoid this is by doing what they've done here, is keeping the plant to a manageable size and doing some pruning in here so that most of these branches aren't touching. I can come in here, and when you prune this, I would want to come and be able to put my arm in any direction through this plant without two branches touching each other. Because what this does is it allows airflow in the canopy. When we have a lot of rain, when we have high humidity in our gardens here, we get this stagnant, moist situation, which is a perfect environment for disease spread. So if we can eliminate the disease triangle in this situation, we've got the host, which in this case is the fig. We've got the pathogen, which is the fungal rust. And then we have to have a suitable environment for that pathogen to take hold. And that could easily become the situation here, but by pruning and allowing air and sunlight to migrate into this canopy after a rain, that moisture will evaporate, and it is going to greatly lessen the potential for fig rust to take hold on the plant. This time of year, late summer, the plant's been going through a lot of stress all summer long. We've had good heavy rainfalls. I would expect in a normal situation to see more disease pressure on this plant, but because of this pruning and the fact that this plant is raised up in this raised bed out here in the open, plenty of sunlight, I hardly see any rust on here whatsoever. And the other good thing that I see is that there's young developing fruit all over it. So here within the next couple weeks, somebody's going to be enjoying some delicious figs. Pretty cool.
Okay, so here just shows the right plant. We, as gardeners, we want to try everything, but not everything is going to work for us. So we can go. These links are messed up here, but you can find this when we go to Aggie Horticulture website and go to the vegetable section, and then the vegetable selector tool that's located in there. We would choose this region G, and we would search for varieties of vegetables that grow well for us. Similar to that, if we go to the fruit and nut section of Aggie Horticulture, we could pull the publications up for each particular fruit that we want to try to grow, and it's going to offer varieties that we have tested that grow well here in Texas, and we're going to start off with a much better plant for the specific spot. As we get a little further down into IPM with disease, it's our mechanical practices section here. Like I've mentioned, removing the plant, unfortunately, is a suitable option here. Is just to get that infected plant out of the garden so it doesn't impact more plants. If there's just a portion of the plant that's showing some symptoms, it's just to, using sanitary practices, remove that part of the plant and get it out of there. And for some things, particularly with just sooty mold that's growing on the leaves of plants, we can simply hit that with a high pressure water nozzle to knock that sooty mold residue off the leaves and move on. Organic control, there are several products that are listed organically for disease management. Neem, horticultural oils and soaps we can find in the garden centers. But again, just because we have the word organic on there does not mean that this does not have negative consequences with it. So always read and follow the label when you're using any kind of pesticide, whether it's a conventional chemical product or an organic option. Yep, read the label. Read the label always. And this is what I mentioned earlier with the question about just the dishwashing soap. If you've done plenty of research on that and you've done some trial and error, that is suitable. But when you do those, you're on your own. But when you buy a product that is labeled for chemical control, it comes with instructions on how to use that product safely. And so always open that up and read the label thoroughly. With diseases, we have infectious diseases and non-infectious diseases. Okay, so some of these are just going to be plant specific. These are going to be just caused by stress, by other damages, other factors that maybe we've created. And then there's going to be diseases that tend to be caused by the living organisms, such as virus, bacteria, and fungi. And these will migrate in the garden, so we have to be careful with those. But the non-infectious disease problems tend to be isolated and easy for us to address. And we'll talk about that right here.
This garden is blessed with an assortment of different citrus, and citrus is a fantastic fruiting shrub for us in Fort Bend County. We do have some threats that are going on with citrus right now with a couple bacterial diseases, but nonetheless, we still have an opportunity to grow citrus, and they produce a lot of fruit for us most years. So they're definitely worth their spot in the garden. This one here is a pretty good example of what we need to be kind of looking around in here. Overall, the plant looks pretty good. It's bushy. We've got some new leaves. We've got some larger dark green leaves on here. All this new growth here is this lime green. That's real soft. Some things that we would want to try to identify. First one is leaf miner, just like we talked about with these other plants. Citrus leaf miner is very common for us, and in most situations, we just leave it alone. If it gets to the point where the whole plant, where all the leaves are curled up, contorted, and not being able to sufficiently go through photosynthesis, then we might have a problem that we have to deal with. But if you just see a little bit of it randomly on the plant, there's nothing to worry about. Other thing that's pretty common in citrus is going to be nutrient deficiency. These plants are heavy feeders. They need a lot of nutrients to grow. We need iron, we need magnesium, and we need a lot of nitrogen to keep these leaves growing and to keep them real dark green so that they're conducting photosynthesis properly. So if we're not regularly feeding these plants, most citrus are showing some symptoms like this leaf here, if we can see it. We have some yellow in between the veins of the leaf. Over here on this leaf, we have some yellowing in between the veins of the leaf, and periodically we'll see more of it. This plant looks pretty good overall, health-wise. There's a little bit of damage from some caterpillars. There is a certain swallowtail species that will gnaw on foliage, chewing away around the margin. But if all we're seeing is this, we're not going to do anything about it. We're gonna let those butterflies complete their life cycle. Okay, so all in all, up here we're looking okay. I see a little bit of suspect issue at the top up here. If we have a little branch like this, where the leaves are mottled and spotted and just not really looking good, the easiest step early on is just to bring some pruners out there and then sanitize them, prune this off, and then dip those pruners in some sanitizing solution in case we're dealing with a small little pocket of diseased tissue that either has some fungal or bacterial pathogen working in it. One thing else that I want to show you here on this particular plant that's a little funny, if I can get down to the bottom and zoom in on the base of this plant. Okay, now this one's kind of funny. So I see this big gorged area at the base of the plant. Right here, it's pretty big. What we're seeing here is this is the rootstock. Okay, most citrus are grafted onto a rootstock. So at this point right here, we can see the difference. This is our graft, the scion, right? That is the variety of citrus that we were hoping to find. So on this one here, this is a Valencia orange. So the Valencia orange was grafted onto this rootstock of what we call sour orange. And this rootstock is doing well. It is full of starch, but it's having a hard time transferring that starch through this union. And so that starch piles up, and so we get a trunk that's much bigger than the top of the plant. Right now, it's not too much of a problem. If we start seeing more sprouts, like here, okay, we need to prick those off as they develop, because these are the rootstock. This is the trifoliate orange, or the sour orange, that is growing from the roots, and these do not produce the citrus that we would want to eat. So we have to keep those off of here. And if I'm looking here, I'd have to ask some questions about this spot and this spot. Unfortunately, what I think happened is kind of what happened to that persimmon, is maybe we did some pruning here early on, and we tried to get those flush, and we ended up with an open wound here. And this is that black oozing sap here that I mentioned that is indicative of some bacterial issue in here that it's probably not finished doing its thing. This is probably going to end up losing the bark around this area and back here. So we would just watch this. If this gets real bad and the tree starts going downhill, we would want to get this out of here. But again, a good example of what not to do with pruning is to allow these bacterial soft rot infections to start developing on the tree. This plant that we're looking at right here is a Japanese persimmon. And while there is one little persimmon up there, this tree is in really bad shape. It's lost a lot of foliage. It's got some yellowing leaves on it. We've got a lot of this lichen growing on the trunk, which is a sign that the plant is not actively growing. If this tree was healthy, it would be sloughing off this secondary bark as it grows. So if I see lichen or if I see ball moss on a tree, it's a pretty good clue something is wrong with it and it's not actively growing. So this plant here has a pretty big problem with it, and I'm going to try. I'm all by myself here, so I'm trying my best to get the right shot. This right there, okay, is our problem. Now, what happened probably here early on in the tree is here, 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 and here, there were some branches that were cut flush, like this one. Cut flush, and we didn't leave a little branch collar, a little nub here, to allow that wound to heal. If we cut these flush on the trees, we get past this natural defense system called the abscission point that will heal over and cover that wound eventually. If we cut past that, we get this. We just get this open sore that doesn't heal over. And that allows bacteria to get in here to start causing this slime. Early on, this is probably black and wet, and it just starts killing the bark, the whole bark, the primary xylem and phloem, and it's just moved down this way and it's moved up this way, and it's taken all the bark with it. So this is just pithwood, the center of the tree. This is dead. The only living tissue is this primary phloem and xylem, and this tree is at about 25% capacity. So it's only getting 25% of the water and nutrients that it needs to survive. That's why the canopy looks so bad and it's not growing. So when we see this here, there's no turning back. There's no Band-Aid we could put on this to make the tree get better. So we really needed to get this out of here, pull this tree up, and then replant this bed with a young, vigorous tree of another species probably that is going to produce what we want, which is fruit. Instead of nurturing this tree that's going to gradually go downhill anyway, early on, cut your losses, plant something else, get it up and going so that you can start harvesting fruit off this spot.
Okay, we got one more short video here, and then I'll be answering some questions. Never mind then, I don't have it in there. Well, I can just discuss that one as needed. The last video that I had in there was hopefully to answer a question on what to recognize as far as damage that you want to address that may be disease related or just older foliage that may be caused by the stress and age. Sometimes we get leaves that get windburn and get damaged that way, or just older leaves that just kind of fall apart. May have holes in them for other reasons, but just to know when to say when on those. And that's just a process that you learn with time. And you know, if we haven't identified a specific pest or disease on there, If the new foliage is starting green, then we just leave it be and move on with it. Again, with all of these, it's based off the concept of a threshold. Once we have a plant that is not performing, is stressed, and is not guiding us towards the goal of food production, something that we could harvest, then we're wasting our time and we need to cut our losses and get those plants out of there. But up until we get to that point, we try our best to utilize all these tools with integrated pest management to help us get there. So within this one final slide here, again, these are several resources that we have to help guide those decisions. The first one is Aggie Horticulture, and there's a wealth of information there on fruits, nuts, vegetables, earth kind landscaping, etc. Soil testing at tamu.edu. This is our soil and water testing laboratory, so we can make sure that we have the right nutritional balance in our soil. Plant clinic.tamu.edu. This is our plant disease diagnostic lab. So if you think that you've identified a specific pathogen or disease on your plant, you can send this in and then they will qualify that and give recommendations on moving forward. At FBMG, that's FortBendMasterGardener.org, you can submit questions to us there. Just go to contact us on that website, and we have a range of methods that you can get a hold of our hotline team to help answer those questions. And further than that, giving us a call or email here at the office at fortbend.agrilife.org